Welcome to this, the 12th episode of Mohammed's criminal enterprise. We began this by exploring the events that pertain to what's called the Battle of Badr, or more correctly, the terrorist raid of Mohammed's kin, his former neighbors, those who knew him best at Wadi in Arabia, known as Badr. It was a horrific scene, and it was grotesquely immoral because the entire impetus for the terrorist raid was to rob a caravan. There was no intent on protecting Muslims. There was no hint of religiosity. It was strictly a raid for no other reason to steal the property that belonged to others. And as the raid progressed, according to everything we read, Mohammed and his pretend God did everything they could to make the carnage as bloody as possible. It wasn't enough to steal. They would also kill and celebrate both. The Quran surah that was recited following the Battle of Badr was designed to resolve the conflict between Islam and morality. The neophyte Muslims in Yathrib recognized that stealing was immoral. They recognized that killing was wrong. They realized that going after a caravan of businessmen who were related, fathers, brothers, sons, and plundering them while celebrating the destruction and the savagery was grotesque. And so when the Muslims came back all full of themselves with Muhammad, they needed some convincing that, well, in this new religion, blood and booty were good. So we're going to continue to tell this tale because once one understands that this is the raid that made Islam. Prior to this time, Islam was essentially comatose. It didn't even have a pulse. Muhammad had been laughed out of Kaabaville, which was actually Petra, in shame because he had made an utter fool of himself. 99.9% of those who actually heard the Quran recited from Muhammad's lips and actually knew the non-prophet of Islam laughed at him. He was a joke, and everyone who heard him speak, who was familiar with him, more familiar than any Muslim today, knew that Muhammad was a laughingstock, that he was plagiarizing the lore of other people, that he was covetous and sadistic. They even said correctly that he was demon possessed, something Muhammad admitted. And so he was laughed out of town following the satanic verses and the knight's journey that was the wild ass ride to the winged donk mule to the non-existent temple in the unnamed city, which they later claimed was Jerusalem. That the whole thing was just so pathetic that the only way that Muhammad could keep his gang together was to get a quick score. You see, Muhammad really became no different than the raiders that had preceded him and those who would follow him, like Genghis Khan. Once you start convincing people that stealing is lawful and good, and that to be a raider and make your economy based on stealing from others, you have to continually satiate those desires. The thieves will quickly turn on the godfather of the criminal enterprise unless there is a steady flow of booty. And that to a large degree, is what happened. I'm laughing because the Wookster here is taking his frustrations out on some kind of a plush toy, and his first goal is to take the squeaker out. We call it a squeaker automy, and that's what he's doing at the time. So as we continue to review this indictment of Islam from Islam's lone nonprofit and by testimony of its singular ungod, we are confronted with the fact that in the last surah that we read in our last episode, the 20th verse of the 8th surah, the spoils of war, Muhammad said that anytime he speaks, he must be believed, he must be followed, he must be obeyed. Now, that's not Allah. That's Muhammad. Muhammad, who was arguably the worst man who ever lived. He was a pedophile, and the world ought not respect pedophiles. He was a rapist, and that's not good either. He was a misogynist. He was perverted in all of his sexuality. He was a bloodthirsty terrorist, led 75 terrorist raids, led or inspired in the first 10 years of Islam. He was enshrined, and his religion came into vogue with the Pledge of Aqaba, which was a pledge to wage war against all mankind. Mass murder, genocide is probably not the worst or best idea either. Muhammad was sadistic. He was a psychopath. He enjoyed torturing people to death. So this man, by any standard, particularly since he made his living by stealing from others, that's just not a good idea. But nonetheless, I've got the Wookiee tale here just telling me, you just focus on what you're doing and I'll do my job. And so when we recognize that that a Muslim must follow Muhammad's example, follow Muhammad's orders, must believe in Muhammad, then we're left in an interesting place because the Quran purports to be Allah speaking. And so you can't follow Muhammad's orders. You can't follow Muhammad's example in the Quran because Muhammad's example isn't laid out in the Quran. Muhammad's words aren't presented in the Quran according to the Quran. And so that leaves you with the fact that Islam can't be practiced. There is no Islam. There are no Muslims without the Islamic hadith. And the oldest source of hadith is Ishaq's Sirah, followed by Tabari's Tariq, and then Bukhari's hadith collection. And the portrait they paint of Muhammad, well, by comparison, Adolf Hitler is a saint. By comparison, Tamerlane is a good guy. I mean, there is nothing beneath this man morally. Nothing. I don't say that as my opinion. I tell you that as an absolute fact. Now, here is Ishaq 3:22. Allah said, "Do not turn away from Muhammad when he is speaking to you. Do not contradict his orders. Do not be a hypocrite, one who pretends to be obedient to him, then disobeys him. Those who do so will receive my vengeance. You must respond to the apostle when he summons you to war." Not only is the ungod of Islam, and Allah is no more God than a garden slug. Not only is this wannabe God demanding that all Muslims capitulate and surrender their free will and obey in all circumstances Muhammad, being obedient to him, recognizing that he, by any moral standard, is the worst human who ever lived. The specific example is you must respond to Mohammad when he summons you to war. Because according to the Quran, according to the Hadith, according to Allah, according to Mohammed, Islam is a war against all mankind. That's the truth. Allah so hates humankind that he seeks our extinction. Muslims aren't just to commit to continual war against all non-Muslims. And this doesn't even classify an enemy, just summons you to war, which is a continued state in Islam. In the first 100 years of Islam, Muslims obliterated 1/3 of the planet's population. They killed over 100 million people, and the number is probably closer to 200 million. Why has the world allowed a religion devoted to the annihilation of humankind to survive? Why has Europe and the United States invited those infected with this genocidal plot to eliminate all humankind into their countries? Do you know that it's actually worse than Allah wanting Muslims to wipe out all humankind? You know why? Because in the Quran, in the 33rd surah, Muhammad says there's only two kinds of Muslims. Those who have died killing for Allah, and those who are waiting to die to kill for Allah. So it's human sacrifice on an entirely different level. It's not only that the victim is sacrificed, but the person doing the sacrifice for Allah must also die. It is the obliteration of the human race. Now you might ask, well, how is it possible for that to be true? Well, first of all, I'm telling you emphatically, it is true. That is what the Quran calls for. That is what the Hadith call for. That is the simple truth about Islam. There is no question that what I have just told you is true, that Islam began with exactly this, a call to war against all mankind. And it is absolutely true that the Quran in this surah and in so many others commands Muslims to fight and kill for Allah. And it is also true that Allah in the 33rd surah insists that all Muslims must die killing for him. So my conclusion is a statement of fact. So you might question, well, what kind of a God would call for the annihilation of humankind? One who's not a God. One who wants to be believed he is God, that wants to belittle the real God by removing from that real God, by corrupting and murdering the one being that the actual God loved so much that he devoted himself to our betterment. Yahweh loves humankind. Yahweh wants all of us to be part of his family. Yahweh is committed to our well-being, to lifting us up, to loving us as his children. And Allah is none other than Hasatan. And for him, he doesn't want to be the adversary. No, he wants to be greater than the God who loves and who has created humans, and he's going about it by obliterating all humankind. Islam is simply the most deadly disease ever perpetrated on humanity. That is not an opinion. It is a statement of fact. Technically, one cannot be a bad Muslim under this scenario. And this is the scenario of the Quran and Hadith. A peaceful, loving person is either a non-Muslim or a hypocrite. Therefore, all true Muslims must obey Islam's dictates, which makes all Muslims bad people. You can be a non-Muslim, you can be a hypocrite and pretend you're a Muslim and be a decent person, but you cannot be a good Muslim, a true Muslim, unless you are genocidal. Statement of fact again. For the earth to tolerate a religion that requires all of its adherents to kill says there's something exceedingly wrong with the thinking and the morality of humankind. And this is particularly true today, where there is about 1 billion people today that have been so badly indoctrinated in progressive, woke, cancel culture, liberal, socialistic, communistic academia. They've lost the ability to think. They're nothing but political zombies without morality, ignorant, irrational, immoral. And they have partnered with Islam, the religion most estranged from what they claim to believe, in that it is misogynistic, it is unenlightened, it is deadly, it is exceedingly hateful. And collectively, this billion people who have great influence in academia and in the media and in politics, and now have a huge support base with at least 1 billion unthinking Europeans and Americans, have partnered with Islam. And this alliance is the greatest threat to the survival of our planet that the earth has ever known. Muhammad's summons was to raid civilians and steal their property. That was his order. So if you were a Muslim, you must be committed to stealing from others and killing them in the process. This wasn't holy war, it was terrorism. Also, to follow Muhammad's orders, as Allah is compelling, one must understand the Sunnah and come to comply with its hadith. That is the only place that the non-prophet's commands and terrorist example can be found. I call him the non-prophet because, well, you can't call a man a prophet and be sane if you know that he never issued a single prophetic pronouncement that came true. I call Allah an ungod because you cannot refer to him as God if you know that he is a sadistic and demonic spirit. All of this is evident through the Quran and Hadith, so I'm just simply using terms that are more accurate. Unless you see Muhammad as Allah, and in that sense, the Quran is just a redundant sunnah. Either way, from this point forward, Islam is nothing more than a terrorist manifesto. Without the Talmud stories that rabbis sold to Muhammad to give the Quran a veneer of religiosity, Muhammad would be no different than Genghis Khan or Tamerlane. He's simply a robber baron, and not a very good one. The creed of Islam, as created by Muhammad and Allah, is obey Muhammad, fight for Muhammad, and pay Muhammad. Now, since Muhammad is worm rot, he is certifiably dead, what are Muslims doing? What in the world are they doing? I mean, you would think there's 1,900,000,000 of them, that some of them would be able to actually read and think and recognize that in 100% of the portrayals of this man, from the Quran to the Hadith, he is depicted as a sexual pervert, a thief, a liar, a ruthless terrorist, and mass murderer. Unless you view those things as religious values, then you're out of your mind. And if you view terrorism and mass murder, genocide, apartheid as religious values, then you are out of your mind. Either way. Of course, I mention apartheid because leftists have been so opposed to apartheid. They want to accuse, everybody of apartheid. And yet the group most prone to imposing apartheid, in every case where Muslims are the majority, apartheid is imposed on all non-Muslims. They have no rights. They can't vote. They can't own property. They can't engage in business without severe taxation. They are treated worse than animals. Every Islamic country imposes apartheid. And for all of Islam's existence, it has pursued genocide. Since the last Quranic pronouncement was too transparent even for Islam's prophet, the megalomaniacs stepped aside momentarily and placed themselves on equal footing with their God. But now to live, a Muslim must honor the call to kill. Quran 8:24. O you who believe. This would be Muslims. It could have just been written, all those who have capitulated and are now slaves to Allah. Respond to Lillahi and his Rasul when he calls you to what gives you life. He just said you must kill. And so in Islam, a Muslim gains life by killing. I mean, the stories of Vlad the Impaler and Dracula and vampires came after Islam. It was created because of Islam. Vlad was one of those people in Romania that tried to stop the Islamic conquest of his country, and that's how he developed his reputation. He realized that you couldn't defeat Islam unless you were as ruthless as Islam. Well, that was his conclusion. I disagree with him, but that was his conclusion. That's why he developed that reputation. But this is essentially the worst form of parasite. It's a blood-sucking parasite. You must respond. I'm going to say the name that they intended. It was actually written as Lillahi, but you must respond to Allah and his Rasul, his messenger, when he calls you to what gives you life. They just were called to kill. And because killing is what provides life, Muslims are bloodthirsty parasites. They're vampires. And know that Allah Yahowah comes between a man and his heart, and that to him you will be gathered. Oh, don't worry about your conscience. Allah, he has an answer for that. He will come between a man and his heart. Yahowah. Quran 8:25. And fear a trial, a tumult, and tribulation, which will not afflict or affect those who zalam, disbelieve, deny, and do wrong among you exclusively. And know that Allah, severe, the penalty and punishment. He left out the verb is and the preposition in, so I thought I'd throw them or share it as it was actually recited. So now he is saying not only am I going to cauterize your heart so that you have no feelings, no empathy, no compassion for those you are plundering, abducting, and murdering? That the afflictions that I imposed on those that Muslims are now abducting, torturing, plundering, and murdering will also affect you and not them exclusively. So you better watch out. Allah's going to get you. Know that Allah is severe in penalty and punishment. So, what do you think is the most severe in penalty and punishment? That would say, I'm going to cauterize your heart so you have no empathy, so that you can kill and plunder and abduct with crazed desire, and you'll feel no remorse. Who, what would say such a thing? Now, the world knows him as Satan. They just don't know that Allah is Satan. One of the most repeated phrases in the Quran is that Allah, Allahi, Allahu is severe in penalty and punishment. Islam is a carrot and stick. The carrot of Islam is that you get to be a terrorist. You get to go off and rape and plunder and steal, and you get to keep 80% of whatever you steal. Whatever blood that you shed, you can get your jollies on torturing people because there's no remorse. And then not only can you have an economy that's based upon stealing, but if you're killed, and when you're killed, killing for Islam, you are promised a brothel. You're promised babes in paradise that have perpetual virginity. That's what you're promised. That's the carrot. Now, I don't personally, being a moral person, don't want any part of that. I would no more want a perpetual virgin, the man in the moon. It's a woman who is not going to enjoy that sexual encounter, and therefore, since she's a perpetual virgin, will never enjoy any sexual encounter, and that it's all about conquest, and that she has absolutely no experience in reciprocal love. That does not sound appealing to me. And wallowing in the blood of others and stealing what others have built, abducting people, engaging in human trafficking, that doesn't appeal to me either. So the carrot of Islam only appeals to those who are really disgusting, and that's why Allah cauterizes the human heart. Now, that's the carrot. You know what the stick is? That if you, as a Muslim, ever cease killing for Allah, if you ever turn your back when there's an opportunity to kill, if you don't steal on command, then Allah is going to torture you forever. If you are peaceful, Allah is severe in punishment. Carrot and the stick of Islam. I don't think either of them are worth a damn. And fact of the matter is, Allah has absolutely no power, no influence, no nothing. You know, all of these Muslims that commit acts of terrorism, screaming Allahu Akbar as the confession, have never figured out that Allah is not Akbar. Allah has never done squat. Ever. Not once. Never once has Allah ever done anything. Allah couldn't even create a sane book. Everything in the Quran that's even quasi-sane is twisted Talmud readings from rabbis in Yathrib. The rest of it is just total and complete vile rubbish. Never a single miracle, never an appearance, never a word, nothing. 1,400 years of absolutely nothing. The rock of the Kaaba can't even turn over. It's not even a good weather rock. It isn't worth crap. You know, Allah's no more God than that black stone that's all fractured in the side of that hideously ugly piece of crap they call the Kaaba. So ugly, they have to cover it in a black blanket. And beware of that temptation, which does not befall only among those who are disbelievers, to the exclusion of others who know that God is severe in punishment. Lots of double negatives there, huh? If you were to remove the double negatives, it's God tempts everyone. Everyone's on trial. Muslims, non-Muslims, the whole earth is on trial, and the only result, to the exclusion of all others, is that Yahweh should make that. Oh God, I'm sorry, Yahweh. I work for Yahweh. I serve Yahweh. Yahweh is always on my mind, and when I come down here and speak of the disgusting rival, this snake, Allah, it is difficult to make that transition. Allah says that for all humankind, you're not only under trial, but you will be convicted. And Allah, as the wannabe God, is severe in punishment. And it should be noted, and I've said this before, every time that Allah is located in the Quran, he is in hell, torturing everyone who did not capitulate to him. Fortunately, Allah is not God. Unfortunately for Muslims, he is in fact in hell, which is where you're going. Yes, indeed. To Allah you will be gathered. They got that part right. With fellow Arabs disbelieving, the Rasuli swearing to slaughter his pagan indulgences and his satanic admissions, followed by his flight of fancy, only a few weak Muslims remained in Mohammed's wavering flock. Yes. The Mohammed in his last days in Kabul threatened to slaughter his kin. And he then accepted and then reneged on what's called the pagan indulgence when he wrote Manat al-Uzza and Alat into the Quran as goddesses along with Allah. The satanic admission is when he reneged on that decision and said that Satan was the one who inspired him. Then he had his flight of fancy, which is when he dreamt that he got out of being mocked in Kabul by flying a winged donkey mule into a city whose name he did not know, to meet in a temple that no longer existed, to meet with Jews who were long dead, so that he could lead them in a couple of rakas of Islamic prostrations prior to going up and meet Allah, through which he had to pass through hell, where all of the inhabitants were women hanging from meat hooks through their breasts. And when he finally does meet Allah after a series of gatekeepers, all of which are Jews, no Muslims, only Jews, he meets with Allah, and all Allah has to say is, I want to be mooned 50 times a day. Such is the stupidity of Islam. And as a result of all of these failures, there were only a few weak and wavering members of Muhammad's flock. Those who knew him disowned him. Their predicament was self-inflicted, but nevertheless, in revisionist mode, the believers were helpless and quivering in fear that they might be killed before killing. So Allah claims to have provided all of the things that they had been afforded by the Jews in Yathrib and that they had just stolen. Quran 8:26. And remember when you, few, he forgot the verb were, few, and he forgot the conjunction and, deemed weak, even helpless in the land, fearing that the men might do away with you, then he sheltered you and strengthened you with his help and provided the good things so that you might be thankful. Yes, the Muslims were few. Those who knew Muhammad best, who actually heard the Quran being recited, universally rejected him. And because they had threatened to slaughter their kin and had behaved like terrorists, they knew that they were at risk of good people eliminating the bad people. So now the sheltering you was they came to Yathrib with Muhammad having claimed to be the Messiah, and on the pledge that the pagans in Yathrib would wage war against all mankind on Muhammad's behalf, and he set himself up as a warlord and was living in Jewish homes that the Muslims had stolen, and on Jewish loans that they had negotiated but not paid. That's how Allah sheltered his people. And the good things were these things they had just stolen. So they should be thankful for the value of kidnapping for ransom and plunder. Quran 8:27. O you who believe, Muslims, do not betray Allah and his Rasul, messenger, nor betray your amanat, things entrusted to you, all of the duties which were ordained while you know. If you're a Muslim, if you cease to believe that Allah, this incompetent, impotent, demonic, and sadistic spirit is God, or that his messenger is the most depraved human who ever lived. And if you start to think that maybe you deserve more than what you have either stolen from others or charity was given to you by others, then you're in serious trouble. Because good Muslims will kill you. And Allah hates you. Don't betray them. That's what it says. Now, if they were actually a God and did something for the people, and if this book were moral and uplifting, and if Muhammad was an example of somebody who wasn't just a murderous thug, then I can see why you would say, you might want to be appreciative. But think it through. How does one betray a God? You can reject a God. You can even rebel against the God's influence. The Jews are really good at that. They're professional at it. But you can't betray them. Unless your God is really, really puny. Constantly claiming credit for what others had done is really pathetic and unseemly. Muhammad's militants had won a skirmish against some poorly equipped and out-of-shape businessmen. The Muslims were a small band of bandits, feeble and despised before Badr. But they remained so, and they remained so, after the skirmish in the sand. No Muslim was carried off by force. They were the kidnappers. As for asylum, they would be, well, as for asylum, I'd be happy to recommend one. Quran 8:28. And know that your wealth and your children are a trial, and that Allah, with him, forgot the verb is, great reward. Having things of value is a trial in Islam. And for most people, if you've worked hard and you've accomplished something and you've accumulated things that are of benefit for yourself and your family, then your wealth is a reward for hard work, for having accomplished something, for having done something worthwhile. But not in Islam. Why? Because, well, all of the wealth is stolen. And so it is a trial. And children being a trial, oh, sure, children are tough to raise. But he's equating property and children together and calling them both a test, a trial. And that if you're loyal to your children, you can't be loyal to Allah, is the concept. It's why I guess Muslim, I can't call them mothers. There's no such thing as a Muslim mother. There's Muslim bomb making facilities and Muslim jihadist factories. And they brag about having sacrificed all of their children to jihad and killing Jews. So for them, there's a great reward. That is the reward, and that is the jihad for women in Islam, is manufacturing jihadists and bomb makers. The idea that children are just a temptation is telling, of course. So is Mohammad suggesting that men might be tempted to abuse their sons as he himself was abused as a child? Or is he asking parents to sacrifice their children and their money on jihad's altar, as so many Muslims do today? While perverse, neither is as twisted as the notion that God's best reward is an inebriated stay in his whorehouse, where the rivers flow with wine and virgin boys are served bottom side up. Quran 8:29. Oh, you who believe. Boy, there's so many. Oh, you. Who in the hell does he think he's talking to? Why even mention it? If you obey and fear. Oh, there it is again. Obey and fear. You know, there's no Hebrew word for obey, because Yahweh doesn't want to be obeyed. And the word that is rendered obey, and your English translations, is actually shama, which means to listen. And fear comes from yare in Hebrew. And yare's primary connotation isn't actually fear, it's revere. But not in Islam. Obey and fear. You see, Yahweh, as God, gave us the gift of free will. We can choose to know Yahweh, reject him, ignore him. Our choice. But there is no free will in Islam. Muslims are slaves. They must obey. And there is no love in Islam. It is all about fear. Allahu Akbar. And he will grant you furqan, criterion. Now, the translators will try to explain furqan by writing in parentheticals to judge between right and wrong. But it means criterion. And makraj, making way for you to get out of your evil deeds, expiating your sins and forgive you. And Allahu is the owner of great booty. You see, in the Torah, It's matzah that is responsible for removing the stench and stigma, the fungus of religion from our souls by taking it to the place where God can never be or can never be seen, which is Sheol, hell. And Dode, as the Son of God, accomplished that for us. But in Islam, forgiveness is coming from obeying and fearing Allah, such that you obey Mohammad and Allah's orders, which to this point have been to kill, to wage war, to steal, to celebrate stealing and murder. And so the evil deeds, which are stealing and committing acts of murder and human trafficking, those will be forgiven according to the Islamic wannabe God. Because the Islamic wannabe God, he is the owner of great booty. That's the criterion. For those who obey in fear, or who obey out of fear, Allah is granting a new criterion to judge between right and wrong. He must do so because from the dawn of time, legal codes and societal mores have defined thievery, murder, and abduction as crimes. But not to worry, Islamic terrorists, because Allah will forgive you of your crimes, corrode your heart, and rid you of a functional conscience. You can be a deadly zombie. But you may want to ask your God a question. If Allah owns such great bounty, such booty, then why does he need you to steal for him? Why did he confiscate the loot from the Badr raid, especially when his prophet claimed that Muslims could keep everything they stole? Why does Allah constantly harangue Muslims for a loan? He even bragged that he chose this group of merchants because he wanted to kill them, not steal like Mohammed. So someone isn't telling the truth. Now, this next line is the antithesis of what actually occurred. We've studied all of the hadith pursuant to the terrorist raid of Badr. Quran 8:30. And wanted to have remember, I think, communicated here, but it's not. So it's just added in parenthetical to make Allah appear illiterate. And when the disbelievers plotted against you, that they might restrain you or to kill you or to get you out, they were plotting, and Allahu too was plotting. And Allahu is the best of the plotters. Oh, man. First of all, it is woke. It is cancel culture. So you can give Allah credit for the invasion of cancel culture and woke long before its time. This is the inverse of reality, which is the basis of cancel culture and woke. It wasn't the disbelievers who plotted against the Muslims. It was exactly the opposite of that, and the Quran and Hadith make that abundantly clear. So Allah has just lied. He has just inverted the reality that he has gloated about. The Quraysh were not trying to plot against, to kill, or to capture Muslims. Exactly the opposite. They were trying to keep the Muslims from killing, plundering, and abducting them. And they weren't very good at it. And now, having projected the faults of these Muslims who were out for blood and booty onto their own family members who were the victims. So victim shaming is what is happening here, that Allah not only blames the victims, but he says that he's a better schemer than were the victims. Now, that may not sound like the best of all conclusions because, well, the schemers were out-schemed because according to everything we read, the Muslims killed them, abducted them, tortured them, robbed them, and sold them for ransom. And so Allah is claiming to be a better schemer than those who were murdered, tortured, abducted, and sold for ransom and plundered. That doesn't make him a very good schemer, does it? Oh, yeah, I am better at plotting schemes than those you just caught off guard and robbed and murdered and abducted. Out of the way, Allah. You are one smart dude. So if you can't make a cogent argument based on the facts, then it's, in my opinion here, it's best to remain silent. I tell all of the nincompoops that I meet on X that regularly that it is always better to seem stupid and by your silence than it is to speak and remove all doubt. That's Allah's mistake here. In this case, we have been pestered with hundreds of iterations of the never-ending argument, which is, Mohammad, you were an idiot, you're a plagiarizer, you've made all this up, you're demon-possessed, you're a schemer, you're a madman, you are insane. And throughout, there were no plots. None. There were no attempts to restrain. There was no threats to kill or exile anyone. So either the single most repetitive rant in the Quran with more than 500 iterations of the never-ending argument is false, and Allah has been dishing us an invalid narrative, or his claim in the 8th surah is untrue. According to the Quran and the Hadith, it was Muhammad and his Muslims who were plotting to restrain, kill, and exile non-Muslims. They were even acting on their plans, as is attested in this surah. Therefore, the opposite of what the Quran is attesting and has already stated is inaccurate. It has just contradicted himself. Now, a wannabe God that contradicts himself is just that, a wannabe. Satan, who admits to being the best of schemers, and whom Yahweh credits with being the best of schemers, had a trifold plan, and he was hell-bent on accomplishing it. First, he wanted to shed his skin and eschew the adversary title so that he might be perceived as a god. Allahu Akbar. Second, he needed to silence the voices of reason, starting with Yahweh's prophets, so there would be no retort to his recitals. So the very rabbis that sold Muhammad the Talmud readings that he twisted and bastardized to create the Quran became genocide victims. And third, he wanted to either subjugate or slaughter humankind, and actually both, hoping that God would not decide to disavow the planet, or he was hoping that God would decide to disavow the planet and leave it to the devil. That's winning for Allah. Yahweh not returning. My job to stand in the way of that and to keep it from happening. And considering his success, Satan is indeed, as Yahweh has labeled him, the best of schemers, and he's just taken the bait and has admitted it's true. And this is one of the things that has always been the case with Hasatan. He is so disrespectful, disdainful of humankind, that he routinely tells us exactly who he is. When Allah admits that he's the best of schemers, he is confessing to the realization that that is exactly what Yahweh called him when he tempted Towrah in the garden. When he calls that which is good in Islam halal, and you recognize that when Yashayahu Isaiah introduces us to Satan, he calls his name halal. When he has Muhammad admit that he was demon possessed during the first horrendous Quran recital in the dark cave while Muhammad was out being a pagan. And then Muhammad, at the end of his life, admits that he had been demon possessed his entire life. It's an admission that Allah is so convinced that he can control humans who he views as meaningless, inferior, disgusting. They'll never figure it out. The same thing is true with Christianity. Christianity is founded by Paul, who wrote the first 14 books of the Christian New Testament. And in his second letter to Corinth, he admits that he is demon possessed. And yet, Christians read right past it. It is Satan taunting them. Satan is saying, you are so stupid. You're going to believe I'm a god when I tell you the opposite is true. And for the most part, he's right. Christianity and its New Testament, Judaism and the Talmud, contributed mightily toward that end, but it wasn't enough. And while Islam would prevail in turning men into murderers and would enslave the dim-witted by the millions and billions, smart people continued to interfere with Allah's quest to believe that he was so special. The rabbi says, and the rabbi is the Lord of Islam, the rabbis of Yathrib. I think they called them Easter eggs, don't they? When somebody puts something in a plot that you're taunting people to find. Well, when they were selling Muhammad Talmud stories to flesh out the Quran and make it appear religious, they said that the word for Lord was rabbi. And it stuck. Rabbi appears throughout the Quran. So the rabbi says, Ishaq 3:23, I am the best of plotters. I have deceived them with my guile so that I delivered you from them. Webster defines guile as the same way that God defines Satan, insidious and cunning, crafty and duplicitous, as a deceiver. Islam admits that Allah is Satan. I mean, this is not a complex conclusion. Quran 8:31. And when our verses, he wanted to say of the Quran but forgot, are recited to them, and of course you did not say written to them because there was no written Arabic at the time, and not a word of this would be written for 100 years. The passage of 4 or 5 generations. They say, indeed, we have listened and we have wanted to. We could say the likes of this. This is nothing but the tales of former people. Well, there's another confession. And when our verses are recited to them, now them is now the victims, those that Allah and Muhammad had the first Muslims butcher, rob, and abduct for ransom. And when these verses are recited to them, and this is true, that according to the Quran and Hadith, 99.999% of those who actually heard the Quran recited by Muhammad and saw Muhammad and came to know him realized that he was a buffoon, that he was a madman, and that he was demon-possessed, and all of this was plagiarized. And Allah's admitting it, saying, yep, he's projecting on the victims, having them say, yes, indeed, we have listened. And if we wanted to, we could say the likes of this. I took up the Siratan challenge, and I think there are 5 of them in goddamn religion, and they're hilarious. Yeah, fact of the matter is, Dr. Seuss writes better sonnets than does Allah. But this is the worst book ever not written. I mean, it is just pathetic. There is nothing in it that has even a nuance of value. It's contradictory, it's demonic, it's immoral, it's plagiarized, it's repulsive. And so, so here are the very people who knew Muhammad and the Quran best, and they're saying, yeah, we've listened. And if we wanted to, we could say the likes of this, but we're not going to because it's stupid. And then they're saying this is nothing but the tales of former people. And they're right, because every religious rite in Islam was established by the very people that the first Muslims killed, the Quraysh. They were the custodians of the Kaaba. They're the ones that venerated the Kaaba. They're the ones that promoted these rocks to gods. They're the ones that instituted the Hajj pilgrimage. They're the ones that instituted the circumambulation, the tossing of stones, the prostration of prayer is theirs. All of it, everything about Islam was conceived by the very people that Allah was having and Muhammad was actually murdering. And they knew it was the tales of former people. And that was the beginning of it. Then the next phase was that Muhammad wasn't inspired as a prophet. So the things that he had heard around the Kaaba were the poems of the Hanif. And the Hanif poems were Arabs that had in Yemen who had converted to Judaism. There's a whole history, and the history of Tubi and the influence on Yathrib is one of the great stories, denouncing the entire narrative of the Quran. And so these Hanif poems, including the Hanif's God, which was our Rahman, permeate the early surahs. So it's nothing but Quraysh paganry that established the Islamic religion around the Kaaba, followed by a plagiarizing of Hanif poems, including their style, their narrative, and their God into the early surahs, held together by the never-ending argument. And then when the time came that Muhammad was mocked out of Kaabaville in shame and went to Yathrib to be supported by some pagans, he found that the rabbis were, well, a godsend. They recited the most ridiculous of their Talmud stories to Muhammad. He twisted them such that they become even more incredulous. And that became the Quran. It is nothing more than the tales of former people. And by the time you get to the last of the surahs chronologically, the Muslims had overhunted Jews, so there were no rabbis anymore to buy Quran surahs from. And so they began to twist apocryphal Christian writings, particularly the Gospel of Thomas, which was so stupid, even the Roman Catholics decided not to include it in their canon. And yet that's what they have. And it's so stupid that the Quran actually claims that Miriam, the mother of the imaginary Jesus, who they call Esau, which is really Esau, the person God said he hated, was the mother of at one time, and then the other is the sister of Moses. I mean, he's wrong by 1,400 years? And of course, he picked the one name, as did Christians, that God uses as an example of don't be like her. Miriam means rebellious, contentious, essentially disgusting from God's point of view. This is right in the Quran. I'm not making this up. It's obvious that those who heard the Quran knew it as well as I do, and that they came to the irrefutable conclusion, which I prove, that the Quran is nothing but an assemblage of plagiarized religious recitals from the Yemeni Hanifs, followed by the rabbis in Yathrib, followed by the Apocrypha Gospels of Thomas, all twisted to suit Mohammed's pathetic agenda, woven together by tales of terror and the never-ending argument. That is the Quran. I prove it in goddamn religion. These people knew it. They lived it. They experienced it. They were eyewitnesses to it. Well, as many of you know, I accepted the Suratan challenge and I bested the ungod fair and square. The 8th Surah is his masterpiece and it pales in comparison to my Suratan. I'll guarantee you that. One of these days I'll put my Suratan to music. I have presented the words of my God also to refute the impostor. And they are brilliant and enlightening and uplifting and enriching by comparison. The reason that the local Arab population in Yathrib was questioning the prophet's credentials is because he had already trotted out the 2nd Surah. It was filled with convoluted stories lifted from the pages of the Talmud, which in proximity to thousands of Jews, they recognized were fabricated because, well, they were the ones that sold Muhammad recitals from the Babylonian Talmud. Therefore, this verse confirms that bad Muslims were smart enough to recognize a false prophet. From the beginning, Allah has been inept at improvised dialogue. This next verse is no exception. Quran 8:32. And when they said, Allahu, if this was this, it the truth of from you, then rain down stones upon us from the sky or bring us a painful torment. This is the response. Allegedly. So they said, all right, Muhammad, we know you're nothing but a fake. And Allah wants to mock the victims. And so he's putting as strained dialogue in their mouths as he puts in Muhammad's mouth. And so in essence, it says, and when they said, Allahu, if this was this, it the truth of from you, then rain down stones on us from the sky or bring a painful torment. So they were at this point so disgusted by elevating their stones in the Kaaba to the status of gods who were threatening them, as opposed to stones in the Kaaba that were gods that were enriching them, that they said, all right, if your God is such a big shot stone, then rain rocks down. I mean, he ought to be able to do that, right? He's a rock god. Stone us. I mean, it was clever as hell. He's a rock god. Stone us. Oh, well, Allah couldn't even do that. So they said, all right, you've threatened us. Every time that we point out that you're a fraud, you threaten us with a painful punishment. Bring it on. Show us that your God is capable of something. I mean, our rock gods here in the Kaaba make us money. Prove to us that your God is capable of something. Otherwise, you're just nothing but an imposter, a fraud. We're tired of it. Go away. Quran 8:33. But not is Allahu that he punishes them while you are among them, and not is Allahu the one who punishes them while they seek forgiveness. Which is Allahu saying, Allah saying, okay, you got me. I am a rock god, and I can't even go so far as to stone you. That ought to be in my power alley, right? But I can't do it. And as for the painful punishments, yeah, it's a threat, and it works on a lot of people, but I understand it's not working on you, and I can't make it happen. So I'm going to tell you that my excuse is that I'm not going to punish them while you were among them, except for guess what? He did. And worse, the punishment was to have Muslims act as monsters. And by the way, there was none of the Koresh that were seeking forgiveness. They had nothing to be forgiven for. It was the Muslims that needed to seek for forgiveness. Now, it would have been appropriate for the Quraysh to rebuff Muhammad's constant Quranic haranguing, claiming that the sky was going to fall on them and the mountains were going to run away and that they were going to suffer painful punishments. But it would never have been stated like this. First, Rahman was Muhammad's God at the time, not Allahu. Rahman was the god of the Yemeni Hanifs, and so the initial Qurans are to our Rahman. Second, since the Quranic God never spoke to anyone, they would not have spoken to him. From what they had endured, Muhammad was a pest, and his God did not exist. So they would have addressed the false prophet pestering them, not his invisible friend. This is especially so because Muhammad's extended family and former friends correctly perceived that the Quranic God was the devil and that Muhammad was demon-possessed, and they said so, and the Quran reflects it. And third, they would not have parroted Quranic platitudes and said, "It the truth," or have spoken of raining stones from the sky, and especially not of painful punishments. This was the demented ungod's stilted vocabulary, not theirs. The Kabbalians were not questioning whether Allahu could rain down stones from the sky, as he falsely claimed to have done, or whether he could or would be able to punish them for disbelieving. They witnessed over the course of 12 years that it was all bluster and bluff without any substance. And they had said so hundreds of times. The eyewitnesses recognized that the voice of the Quran was impotent and that the Quraysh were simply ignored or annoyed by him. And that's the truth. Those who knew Muhammad best, who were subject to the first Quran recitals, were annoyed, as should be the world today. They likely said, "Muhammad, you're a pest. Stop it. You're pathetic with all of this whining. Stop threatening us with your false god. You're a fraud, and we know it. You've proven it. We're tired of hearing about it. Shut up or put up. Or preferably, just go away and leave us alone." Now that's the truth. And it explains why Allahu copped a plea and claimed that the only reason he hadn't already brought about his oft-threatened day of doom was because Muhammad was still there. But that's absurd. Muhammad wasn't there anymore by the time of the 8th surah. He was long gone. And now he was out hunting his own kin at Badar. And when Muhammad finally returned to subjugate the Quraysh, he was there once again making the statement nonsensical. So when the Quraysh were actually subjugated, Muhammad was actually there. But Allah just said, "I'm withholding punishment while you were there." But he was there when Muhammad punished them. This guy, the Quran can't even lie well. The fact is, without lies, there would be no Quran, but there isn't even a good lie in the Quran. So I say it's the worst book ever not written. Moving to the next incredulous statement. Having done our homework, we know that the Hadith has been explicit, and it is supported by the Quran. They tell exactly the same story, or they confuse the same story, reveling in the history of the Kaaba's custodianship while showing that all of its pagan religious rites were incorporated without any alteration directly into Islam. But now, since Allahu wanted to claim the somewhat lucrative pagan scam on behalf of his messenger and confiscate it from the perpetuators, its custodians, he is denouncing what he has endorsed. even though Muhammad and Muslims would continue to perform all of the rituals at the same time, at the same place, in the same way. Quran 8:34. But what for them that not punish them, Allahu, while they hinder from the mosque al-haram, forbidden or holy, while not they are its guardians, not its guardians except ones who fear, but most of them do not know. Their salat, obligatory prostration prayer at the house, was nothing but whistling and clapping. So taste the punishment because you used to disbelieve. Now, I'm going to share some insights on this, and we'll return to this passage in the next installment of Muhammad's criminal enterprise. But I want to leave you with some thoughts. What Allah has just admitted and the Quran has just acknowledged is everything I've told you over and over again. That the Quraysh, Muhammad's neighbors, extended family, had established the Kaaba as a pagan shrine and a lucrative pilgrimage site long before Muhammad was born. And it was purely pagan. There were 365 rock gods and this rock pile. Allah, by the way, wasn't even one of them. Allah was a come lately in this process. The chief deities were Alat, Manat, and Al-Uzza. And so Allah is acknowledging exactly what I've said, that the mosque, which was the place of prostration, is actually a term derived from the pagan Arabs around the Kaaba, and that Al-Haram was established by these pagans long before Muhammad was born or Allah was even known. And Al-Haram is one of those strange words because context determines whether it is the worst or the best. You see, haram is perceived as that which is evil and forbidden in Islam. So it's actually the forbidden mosque. And haram is used more in concert with that which is evil and wrong and forbidden than it is with that which is holy. And there's no distinction between the spelling. Same word. So this was the forbidden mosque or this was the holy mosque. You pick. That's another one of Allah's I'm going to be in your face with all of this. So the mosque, even the term al-haram, was established, and the Quraysh were in fact its custodians long before Muhammad stole all of their pagan religious rites to make Islam. Just stole them all and created a counterfeit of them as Islamic. And now he's saying, Allah's saying, but they're not his guardians because, well, I want my guy to be the guardian because they don't fear me. And I only want custodians of my rock pile who are afraid of me. That's what he just said. I have long requested that people stop burning the Quran and start reading it. I have long requested that Israel stops bombing Hamas and starts fighting the war against Islam by reciting Islam's scriptures. There is nothing more lethal to this death cult of Islam than to actually know what its wannabe God and non-prophet had to say. And that is our conclusion of this episode of the YAHOWAH blog.